Thank you everyone for coming to the webinar. The topic of discussion or the topic of interest for today's webinar is that how a startup or a new organization that is coming up in India can do to make sure that they are more compliant towards the cybersecurity norms that are coming in. Right. So that is the focus for our webinar today. And we will have Aditya from Flipkart, who is an IT and cybersecurity compliance expert, who would be joining us in a few more minutes. Right. So we would also hear Aditya's views on what a data protection framework how it can help a startup build their infrastructure and how it can actually mature their business to an extent where they can also focus more on building resilient cybersecurity systems as well as protecting customers' data. So this kind of instills a balance of trust, a balance of getting more business from their customers, as well as developing those trust with their clients as well. So those are a few aspects or a few advantages of developing a cybersecurity framework in an organization, and that would be our point of discussion for today. Right. So we also have Aditya here, right? We will start with this webinar now. Aditya, thank you for joining in. I was just talking to everyone and discussing about how a data protection framework can help a startup and how can it develop their infrastructure. So just giving a kind of summary on that.
Nice. Thanks for having me, Krishna. It's really nice to have this webinar. Yes, please. You can start.
Great, Aditya. So, of course, before starting, like we usually do, we have a disclaimer for everyone, right? Whatever views that we represent in this webinar are our personal views, does not represent our organization. And of course, it is definitely not legal advice, right? So this is just for an educational purpose. And it is, of course, to make sure that everyone understands the different nuances of data protection compliances, right? So just a simple disclaimer out here for everyone. And of course, the panelists or the speakers for today, we have Aditya from Flipkart, who is an IT and cybersecurity compliance expert. And there's, of course, me. And if you have not been a part of our other webinars, then I'm a co-founder here at Tsaaro. I look after the security consulting practice. So Aditya, I would just hand it over to you. If you could give a quick introduction about yourself and tell people about your daily activities or operations at Flipkart.
Sure, Krishna. Thanks for this introduction. So let me start with my introduction. So I work with Flipkart in the IT and cybersecurity compliance. My day revolves around ensuring that cybersecurity practices are in the top-notch position. The data breaches and the data threats are ever evolving. So how to strategize in a way that the systems and the processes are robust enough to to the cyber attacks, to the the respective evolving cyber arenas, and we are robust enough to handle any threats that come across. So majorly it revolves around and discussing with the C-suits, how do we have the respective AOPs in place. The teams are well equipped with the latest trends and technologies, and of course the audit part comes along with it. And as our companies moving into a phase wherein you're hoping to go for IPO or a pre-IPO readiness is a place where we are in. So all these compliances and the area-wise compliances play a very specific part in our growth. So that's some area where I can just throw that I work on the areas.
Perfect. Aditya, thank you so much. I think a lot of our attendees here are keen on understanding because they might represent certain startups or they have certain startups as their clients. And it is usually a difficult ballgame when it comes to startups because the kind of budgets that are allocated to cybersecurity or data protection compliance differs from the scale of every startup. Right. So that is, I think, a few points what we would touch upon in this webinar as well. And we would also discuss about the recent guidelines that CERT and RBI has pushed over and how those guidelines would affect different organizations across the industry and what those guidelines actually mean in advent of the draft data protection bill. That is, of course, that is something that we're all waiting for as an organization. So about Tsaaro, we are a data protection consulting firm. And what that means is that we provide cybersecurity and data privacy services. Of course, a lot of people have already been a part of a webinar, so we will just skip this topic for now. and focus on the agenda for today's discussion. So we will start with the Indian regulations. What are the different regulations that have been put up related to cybersecurity or talking about information technology in general? Then we would also talk about the impact of three critical bills or three critical guidelines, right? First is the data protection bill, which of course has been doing quite the rounds around the industry. The second one would be the RBI guidelines, right? So if you people have been following these different guidelines that have been coming up, the RBI guidelines focuses mostly on banks and financial organizations, and of course how they can what they can do to make sure they have a resilient cyber infrastructure. And then we will talk about the different certain directions that have came up. The certain directions mostly focus on data breaches and what organizations can do to make sure that they can respond to those data breaches, as well as they can inform certain as well about the data breach that has occurred. Now when certain talks about these data breaches, of course, there are certain aspects to it, or there are certain areas of concern that we as a cybersecurity firm would want to highlight as well. And of course, when certain also pushed up these guidelines, they have also mentioned that you need to report a data breach within 6 hours, right? And the definition of data breach or the definition of incidents that certain has defined are also some areas of concern that we would want to highlight today, right? So as an example, certain wants you to report an incident of probing or targeted scanning on critical systems. So Aditya, what do you think? Targeted scanning on critical systems, how often does that happen in an organization of your scale?
Sure. So Krishna, scanning to the targeted systems with all these scanners like College Guard, NISS coming up, and uh, there's a lot of open frameworks available to ensure that framings are in place. Uh, I think it's depending on the size of an organization. And typically, if I talk to you about an organization where I am on to my previous experiences, the critical systems are about of the scanning schedule, which is probably daily or weekly. Varying upon the business that a typical website or the URL handles, and uh, we need to ensure that we are either going for an authenticated or an unauthenticated scans, because these scanners have a lot of potential if we increase the intensity or the loads of on the traffic or the gateways that are the first entrance of the traffic. It can also cause the website to go down. So it has to be a very streamlined strategy. The respective teams have to come in place to ensure that what policy has to be for this particular thing. How do we scan all our assets? And but to say at least in once a month, it should be covered, or even it's let's say a critical or non-critical website or a URL. It must be covered in a framework of, let's say, 3 months or 6 months, ranging on the criticality. Like, in the BCP, we do a BIA. So probably for URLs also, we need to ensure that BIAs are in place, and the respective controls like scanning, and not just scanning, right? Generally, it's just scanning organizations do. They don't formulate a very, strategy for mitigating those risks. It's not just the scanning. Scanning is just the one part. It is mitigating those vulnerabilities, ensuring that the pointers that these scanners are giving are fixed in a timely manner. And of course, it can be covered in a SLA sort of a thing. It's just like an incident, right? We need to have
Right.
a in place that if it's, let's say, a CVSS 10 or a CVSS 9 to 10 vulnerability, so it has to be fixed within this much of that. And that's wherein top management role comes in. The culture of an organization has to play a very vital role in this, ensuring that they set up a very firm thing, that if it's severity which is ranging from 8 to 10, or it may have a high impact on the team or an organization, it has to be fixed. So that's one point I can add.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you, Aditya. So, Aditya, we do a lot of mentee sessions on our webinars, right? And the next slide focuses directly on that. So, we have a very simple question, and we want to understand your perspective, the attendees' perspective, that with businesses becoming more data centric, right? The kind of data that businesses collect these days, given that the systems have enabled all organizations to do that. So, do you think data protection compliance is required? And to do this, just go to menti.com and type in the code that you see here, 24147760, and just share your opinion on if you think that data protection compliance is something that businesses should look forward to, or there should be some kind of framework that businesses should follow. So just share your opinion here, go to menti.com and type in the code. And of course, you can also use the link that is on the chat section. So we would just like to know your opinions. So Aditya, this would kind of give us some insight on what people actually think about the data protection compliances that are coming up. Because I was in a discussion with a friend from another organization, and I was just talking about their perspective on this. And they said that whatever fines that come our way, right, I would focus personally more on the business to go forward, and I can pay that fine, I can handle the PR. So why should I bother about compliance? So that was just their unique perspective that I just also wanted to bring up in this webinar.
Oh, that's one thought. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's
So
just like, we have challans if we jump a red light. Many
exactly.
people have thought if I'm getting late, I'll just pay the challan, right? But then compliances have to be at par, uh, or things are coming up, I can say, in this area.
Definitely. So I think a lot of our attendees feel that data protection compliance is something that is necessary these days. Uh, Apart from the fine aspect, I think one more critical aspect is the reputational loss that happens, right? Because if you are an organization with a large operational base, or you're pan India or global, right, and there is a data breach that happens to your systems, and all your customers' data is breached and available on the dark web or available on the internet, then of course the reputation loss that is assigned is something that is huge. And so what are your views on this, Aditya? I mean, the reputation loss aspect to the data breach.
Oh no, absolutely. And as one point, we as part of the agenda also we have reporting of the data breaches. Laws and compliances are definitely like building pillars for an organization to have a robust framework in place to ensure that things are in place, and in case of any data breaches or losses to the critical system, these must be reported to RBI. But that's one guideline which I'm sure I was also following your LinkedIn account, Krishna, wherein you had specifically mentioned that it's been criticized by many consulting firms, various banks and organizations. So again, it's a tug of war which is going on, but at the end of the day, policies and procedures have to be in line to the compliances. So that's one area which specifically if we talk about Indian geography, we are evolving to it. And yeah, but when we say we are evolving, we just can't be in a gray zone. We have to be ready. We have to be very at par with the guidelines across. Let's say if I talk about GLBA Act or Singapore Government Act, so we have to be at par with these guidelines because many of our businesses are supporting uh, multi geographies, and India being a power of software and being the center of the world right now to support many businesses. So these guidelines or frameworks are very vital for any business to grow in India. That's my point.
Definitely. I mean, I think I agree to it. And I think most of our attendees also somehow agree that data protection compliance is required. Apart from the fact that there are fines and reputational loss that is, of course, associated, one more aspect to it is that cross-border data transfers, right? They are probably an hindrance when it comes to having those laws in countries like Europe and not having a law in a country like India. I'm not sure how those data transfers would work, right? Because if India does not have an adequate data privacy law or a data protection law, then how would those data transfers work, right? So I think that is also something. And here we're just talking about the different acts. So Aditya, let's just go over the different acts or guidelines that we have. So IT Act, right? Of course, the first act. So do you think the IT Act is sufficient in terms of the different guidelines or the laws it talks about?
I'm probably not a legal expert to comment about it, Krishna, but from the experience that I have, I think IT Act 2008 is one which we are referring, and there are many upgrades to it. There are certain clauses which have been changed, and it's again in an evolving shape. I think of course the legal regulatories are burning the midnight oil, if we have to say, and ensuring that better compliances are coming up. But of course, there's a chance of improvement. Like each and every one of us has. And to add, it's in a good shape, I think, but there are certain niches and stitches around it which can always evolve. So that's my opinion.
Definitely. So I also want to understand your views on the different guidelines that have came up. Also, the draft data protection bill. So the draft data protection bill, of course, talks about personal data as well as non-personal data. So do you think it should focus more on the personal data aspect and for now, at least, not focus on the non-personal data that we have?
Yes, yes, absolutely. So, with all the scams coming in, the in the news, uh, there are many scandals which highlight that how the organizations have been stealing data, have been, uh, fishing across the different people, stealing their data and then selling it across, like Data Analytica, scandal of Europe, which was kind of a stepping stone for GDPR to come in place, or there are certain more stories that we hear on internet or read across it. So yes, like you rightly mentioned, we need to have a very specific focus on the personal data, to the information that we collect. Of course, it's a learning that we can have from the respective compliances that are there in place. We can talk about GDPR, and just also to add on to one of the pointers which you were mentioning, that around data localization, Krishna, I'm sure that your team would be aware there is a NPCI guideline around the financial data, which tells that for any of the payment gateways or any of the transactions, let's say UPI, it's specifically for UPI partners, that if uh, let's say I am doing a transaction on Google Pay, or any of these merchants, or which are helping me to do a payment, there has to be a SAR report, system audit reports, which has to specify that how my data is flowing. It talks about very clearly that data has to be stored only in India, a copy has to be retained in India. So uh, I think pointer is to set an accountability for for the firms, and to ensure that they are not misusing the data, or even in the case they are sharing it outside the border, it has to be the data processing, which the guideline calls it. The processing data has to be just transferred only for 24 hours. So uh, there are stringent guidelines in place. I think legal experts are doing good in this area, but for the personal data, like they because of COVID, I think the things have shifted to different focus. The priorities have shifted, but like the experts, your team and other big fours or any other teams that we hear around, it's not a far day that this bill will be a part of our finalized legislature, and everyone will have to follow this, including the organizations like us, or the banks, or you talk about any typical organization handling the personal data. And at the end of the day, data is a new oil that we've all heard across. And
Yeah.
how do we manage that oil? Do we create a scarcity? Do we make different uses of it? How do we extract that thing? It's all depending on us. So these guidelines will definitely help an organization to evolve in a better way only. And to ensure that the information lies in the jurisdiction, it's a good way. Of course, there would be other pointers that people would have, but to set an accountability, these bills and these acts are definitely required.
Definitely, I completely agree with that. I think new regulations are coming up, and as the understanding is increasing between amongst legal experts and the government as well, the stringent guidelines that have been coming up are something that India can probably push across, include different organizations, different type of organizations, different types of data as well, right? And also, since you mentioned scam, right? So I think it reminds me of this Netflix show which talks about this town in Jharkhand, I think which is of course infamous for all the different type of mobile scams that happen, right? So basically there's a small town based in Jharkhand or Chhattisgarh, I'm not sure about the state, but somewhere on the towards the east, right? And a lot of different teenagers in that particular town or city are actively, yeah, so our attendees are aware about it. It's called Jamtara, right? So Jamtara is the town, and of course, a lot of different scams have been propagating from that particular town or that particular area. So all the different UPI scams that you would see these days, right, where people would call you, right, Jamtara in Jharkhand. So where people would call you, ask you to put in an OTP, and they would be in such a hurry that people usually do it, right? And I think a lot of MLAs or MPs have also lost their money in those UPI scams. So that reminded me of that. And of course, as the regulations are something that are coming up, I mean, those areas would also be covered, right? So right. So obviously, we want to keep it an open session as well. So in case anyone has any questions that they want Aditya or me to answer, we would be happy to take it up. You can share your views on the chat section as well, right? So of course, Shubh says that the scam that was happening in Jamtara was just phishing. But of course, we as cybersecurity and data protection, professionals, we understand that phishing is something that is one of the most critical entry vector or attack vector for cybersecurity attacks all over the world. It looks like a fairly simple concept, but it kind of plays with your mind, and a lot of people, a lot of CEOs or executives also fall to the trick of phishing, right? I mean, I see it happen a lot everywhere. CEOs are targeted more for phishing attacks. It's called spear phishing, of course, where those people are targeted, and of course, all the details that the attacker needs, kind of, it is exploited, right? So phishing is, of course, something that we should actively take care of. And the only way or the best way to make sure that phishing is addressed is cybersecurity awareness, right? Everyone or every employee or colleague in your organization should be aware about phishing emails and how to actively track it. Right. So, Aditya, we were focusing on the impact of data protection bill, right? So, what do you think impact would be for a data protection bill in a country like India? Because most of the systems or most of the organizations here work differently. There is not a process, it is not a very process oriented business in India as of now. I mean, I understand that most startups are today process oriented, but what about the small businesses that are running in tier 2, tier 3 cities, and they also collect a lot of different personal data, or healthcare institutions or hospitals, private hospitals in those cities? How do you think it would affect them, the data protection bill?
Yeah, very, very good question, and it's a very hot burning question of now wherein I see a lot many inputs from many people in LinkedIn or any other post that I posted. So just my personal thought to it, like you rightly highlighted about the tier two, tier three cities and the SMME, small scale, medium industries being, getting the digital flavor, and that's how they are progressing. Uh, Organizations, have the typical tier 2 tier 3 organizations are coming with their own websites. They're collecting a lot of PI information. They have their gateways. They take the gateways from uh, Mojo Jojo, or certain other gateways that are very prominent in the market. And with a typical nominal fee, they are expanding the business. And to an amazement, I was seeing a report, probably with the trends of e-commerce. The sellers which are growing in tier 2 cities and tier 3 cities. There's a lot of different flavor that we see in the tier 2 tier 3 cities. Of course, they are very calibrated and skillful in the product that they have, but how technical savvy are they? That's a question. It's still a yellow area for us to identify. It's like a data discovery tool that we have to do, sort of a data discovery thing. So that's where the data protection bill comes in place to the other regulations that we have, and all these things are like a part of an umbrella. These are helping us to have a more data robust framework, I can say, to be more data ready. How do we input the data into our system, store it? Typically for the data, 5 stages of the life cycle. Krishna and I were discussing it heavily. 5 to 6 stages of the life cycle. We acronymed as CSUSAD, which is creation, storage, archival, sharing, usage, and destruction. So basically, the compliances tell us around these policies only. How do we, create the data? How do we? What are the as per the GDPR itself? It also talks about what limit, what data should we capture. It's not that every data has to be captured, and how for what should be the duration of storing the data. Let's say there are NBCI guidelines that financial critical data has to be stored for, 7 to 10 years. So that's applicable for UPIs, for the banks, and everywhere. Now with this impact of draft data protection bill, of course, a lot has been talked about in the market. Cross-border data transfer, restrictions have to be imposed, because with cloud coming in place, there is a SLA of 99 point N, ranging for 4 n's availability. So it's a question that of course there's SOC 1, SOC 2, audited, reported, but how do we audit them? How do we have a right to audit in the compliances wherein we are sharing the data? So the compliances are definitely the expert comments from the legal, but they should have more of a technology angle. So that's where we were just seeing that with a certain guideline ensuring that 6 hours should be the timeline where the cyber incidents have to be reported. But is 6 hour is 6 hours mandating it required? Because it definitely takes a lot of time to establish a incident. So it's a lot of homework or a back work. We have to do a lot of RCA for any organization, for any scale, because the technology is evolving, right? The hackers or the script kiddies, which we call, are pretty much advanced. A lot of rootkits, backdoors, and all those things are susceptible. So prior commenting on any of these and going public about all these things, it has to typically an organization should be given a good amount of time. So notice and consent requirements, of course, we have to enable the user. And uh, also, just in conjunction to the data draft protection bill, there is an iOS policy which iOS is pushing for 30th June, wherein they are saying for any PII, any applications which are hosted on iOS, have they are storing, an application is storing, they have to ensure that by 30th June, kind of a right to forget has been enabled. Of course, it has to be in line to the the local geographical regulations. So, how applicable is it with Indian context? It's again a gray area. But with all these draft protection bills coming in place, that's where we need experts like you. Any organization would want Tsaaro's help, or organizations like you, to help them and help these regulation understand in a layman language that how are they applicable to us. And because often terms the language in the bill are not so easy to understand. It has to be one has to be very legally equipped. One has to be very sound enough in understanding, because they talk in a very subjective language. So, of course, no offense to it, it's all in the due regard, and that's how it should be.
Yes, of course.
But for people like us evolving in this area, it has to come in a more refined way. That's one point I can add to it.
Right, Aditya. So I think I agree with that. I mean, the language, of course, in those guidelines is somehow very ambiguous. It's not very easy to understand. And similar to how you can look at the draft data protection bill, it talks about protecting personal data in a digital format, right? I think we also have a question around it. Just go on to this question. Yeah, I think Abba wanted to share something that IT laws as of now are simply inefficient to meet the EU thresholds. Of course, the IT Act is not something that can be compared to the GDPR. But then again, with transfer impact assessment that are being done these days to make sure that any kind of cross-border data transfer is going to a country where there's an adequate data privacy law, or if there is an impact to that data transfer that is happening to a country. And once enough TIAs or transfer impact assessments are done, I think more EU organizations would be kind of worried about sharing data to India, because India is an outsourcing hub, right? All major countries or developed countries outsource their work to India. And of course, it could probably, of course, it could definitely affect businesses that are being run. For example, larger organizations such as TCS or Infosys or Wipro that are the outsourcing giants in India. And right, so I think ABBA also shared the same thing, that it is going to hit our IT offshoring business. Right. So I think I completely agree with that. So which is why I think the government is also working on these guidelines quickly, because they understand the economic downfall to it, which is why the certain guidelines, the RBI guidelines, are kind of a stepping stone towards the data protection bill. Because in the end, we want to make sure that, of course, the economic trade-off is not something that can be affected in this, which is why the government would definitely take those measures. Right. So, Aditya, we just had a few questions that I would like to take up from the chat section. One is from Tapashankar and it says, right, I think one is from Shivam, and Shivam wants to say, understand what would be the challenges for different businesses, or of course, like we already discussed about the tier 2 and tier 3 cities, wherein local organizations would store data in digital format. How do you think we can, or at least an organization or a government can share that awareness and it can reach those tier 2 and tier 3 cities? Because of course we are mostly from metropolitan cities and we are actively following the data protection bill as well. which is where we are also aware of the nuances or the details of it. But how can we create those awareness or push it towards tier 2 and tier 3 cities? What are your views on that?
Sure, it's a very good and thoughtful question, because it's just like an organization's policies come up, but how are end users given awareness about it? So it's a typical just top to bottom approach that has to follow, right? So taking the example of India, tier two, tier three cities, or the villages, starting from the gram panchayats, ruling up to the the areas where we have district commissioners, and then rolling up to the the governor's rule, the governors handling a state, or UTs, the union territories in that case. So of course there has to be a lot of marketing around it. When we have a lot when we have seen how the campaigns are run, Jan Dhan Yojana, or the campaigns to educate the users. So it has to follow a very similar trend, but probably it has to come up like a sign off thing, that for all the policies that we have in place, we try to take a sign off. There are videos in across an organization that try to educate. There are tests around it. So some strategy, I'm not saying exactly that you show a video or take a test, but some
Mhm.
strategy like this, where in prior, let's say, I'm sure there won't be a far off day wherein a minister or a local MLA campaigning, telling that hum aapka data bachayenge, aap hame vote dijiye. So something like this, I'm sure would not be far sighted, because there's a lot of buzz around the data. And uh, to an amazement, I was in a tier 2 city, and I was seeing that even the ladies, quite at a elderly in age, they were also not sharing the data. Of course, this trend is very new. Many people are sharing the data. We know, even if we enter any flat, or you go to any flat, you just freely enter all your details. It's about anyone. We enter about everything. And
Yeah.
one of the conferences that I was in lately, it's in India. We are the free providers of data. We have given data like anonymously. We have been the anonymous providers of data. So of course, it's a cultural shift as a country we have to do, and it's a collective thing. Of course, it has to come from a top to bottom approach, but these things are more voluntarily approached as well. So probably organizations like you will have to contribute a lot in it, because you have a good clientele base. And the webinars like this can also be a forum wherein there are education given to the users to ensure that only limited amount of data is exposed. So exposure for the data has to be a point in concern. We just can't expose everything. It's pretty scary. And then at the end of the day, we are all humans. We can't prevent ourselves from keeping the passwords of the people, of the things that are close to us. So everything is knitted, everything is closely connected, and that's when things go fall apart. So that's one thing, I think people have to think about it, and a cultural shift.
I agree. I think the awareness part is something that is tricky. And I think one of the challenges that I can immediately see is India being a multilingual country, right? I don't think it would be easy to communicate that sort of mandate to every village or every town. Because when you make those conversions from one language to another, I think the meaning of that particular conversion might also change, right? I mean, personal data could, I don't know, when it reaches to someone who is from a state wherein the language is also something that is very specific to a community. I am not sure how that would make them understand what personal data is about, because everyone uses YouTube, everyone uses TikTok, and you would see a smartphone in almost everyone's hand these days in India. And if they're using those applications, or if they're using that smartphone, there is some data transfer that is definitely happening, right? And because of course, internet being so cheap comparatively in India as opposed to other countries, I think India has also had this tech boom, and the data sharing aspect of it is something that has been propagated now. It's very widely spread. We have no idea how much data India is producing every day, given that tier one cities are not the only primary focus anymore, right? And if you look at other organizations such as if you have noticed these days, I think you might also have noticed, Aditya, that Snapdeal used to be a very large player back when e-commerce websites were coming up, right? But these days you don't see a lot of advertisements in around Snapdeal. At least I don't see it in Delhi, I don't see it in Mumbai or Bangalore. But as soon as I was in a tier two or a tier three city, I started seeing advertisements of Snapdeal. Right. So I think what they have also understood is that if you cannot capture the market in maybe a tier one city, you can definitely go to a tier two or a tier three city, because even there the internet connectivity is such that you can push those advertisements, you can capture that market as well. So of course, I mean, it's a cultural change that needs to happen. We have to also consider the language barriers that are in India, similar to how it was in Europe as well, because every European country almost has a different language. But the one thing that binds them together is that most of them at least know how to speak English, because that is one common element there. Even if you are a country, maybe if you're from Netherlands or from France, most of those people also speak English, right? So I think that's just my view on this, the kind of challenges that I can see as of now around creating that kind of awareness. So we'll just go back to menti.com quickly, and we would also want to understand your perspective on this question as well, right? So in case there is a cybersecurity incident, then do authorities have the right, or should they be able to make a request of information? Because as of now, you just have to report that to certain, and you would have to propose the controls or measures that you have taken to minimize the impact. But should authorities also be given that kind of privilege or that kind of level where they can request for information or request for, say, logs, right? Because you would do some kind of forensic analysis, and that is how you would come to the conclusion that this is the impact of data breach, this is the amount of data that has been breached, right? And should authorities have that level of involvement in this incident? So Aditya, what are your views on this? Do you think authorities should be given that right? Because data is something that is critical.
Right, absolutely. It's more of a hand-holding sort of a scenario. Probably, again, from a legal perspective, I may not be able to answer, but from the operational effectiveness perspective, it's just to highlighting the authorities that certain things are not working right, or in case if certain things have fell apart, how do we ensure that things will be in place? So majorly ensuring that it's a citizen, it's a country citizens data, and of course as per the legislature, and in one part I was just reading, again I'm not an expert in the legal domain, but the government has a right to know where in case the data has gone outside of jurisdiction, or in case it's been trafficked across for different purposes. So that's one use case that comes to my mind, and probably again, to what I have read across, or to my knowledge, it is governments have a key areas of interest. Let's say for the NBFCs, for the banks, if a data breach happens in a regulated bank, again the impact is different. They are keenly interested how it has happened, or even in case of what I remember for a bank wherein they were migrating from one data center to another data center, and while calling back, uh, they had a firewall rule open, and because of it the data was exposed. It came in the news. So government was keenly interested how did this happen, but it was just a configurational error, which led to this. So how deep the government goes, I think they have their own BIs, they have their own matrices around it, the criticality of business, because banks play a very big role in the functioning of our economy, because a lot of personal uh, finances are being managed of many uh, influential, non-influential, or the respective businesses in India. And in case there's a loss to that information, it is an impact on economy. So probably that's the area of focus that they have for now. But with the compliances coming across and the data bill in the draft stage, I think the government is more keen to keenly interested around all these nuances. Of course, that's the flavor that we see in the market for now.
Right, right. I think most of the people also agree here that authorities should make a request for the information. But I'm more curious about the people who say no, right? Because there are two people who say that the request for information should not be made. Because, of course, the current guidelines, what they kind of tell is that you need to report that incident. You need to make sure that you provide a report to the government about how the data breach happened and what you have done. But I think my concern there would be, Aditya, that I'm not sure if I can trust the organization with that report. Right? How sure would I be that the report that they have presented is actually reflecting of the data breach or the incident that happened? Right. First of all, I mean, I'm not even sure if the organization has a dedicated team who would take care of this, or if they hired the right kind of people who would do this forensic analysis for them, right? So if I don't have all those parameters to assess the report, how would I make sure as a government or as a supervisory or regulatory authority that the report that is being presented to me is actually accurate? So that's just my concern there.
Absolutely, it's a fair concern. It's definitely a fair concern.
Right. So I'll just move on to the chat section, see what people have to say. Right. I think Abba wants to share her opinion that to improve the cybersecurity environment, it is necessary, right? The government should be able to make a request for information, and they should also make people accountable who don't have the appropriate technical and organizational measures in place. Again, the technical and organizational measures from the GDPR is something that, of course, interests me a lot, because the terminology they've used is, I mean, technical and organizational can mean a lot to different organizations across different jurisdictions as well, right? So I really appreciate everyone who's putting in their views as here as well on the chat section. I think this is some really quality content that is coming up on the chat section, especially about how GDPR or how data protection laws should come up and what they should consider, right? So I think this is really nice. I think we'll probably share these different comments here on our next webinar as well, right? So Aditya, now we will talk about the different impact of certain directions and what certain actually requires, right? So I think something that also caught my mind was that there were certain VPCs or VPN providers, right, wherein the government asked that you need to keep a log for 5+ years, and you also have to tell the government and share a list of details such as who was the person who procured that service. You need to share all the different IP addresses that were allocated to that particular person who procured the VPN service. You also have to tell the government the purpose for which they use the VPN. So do you think it is kind of a contradiction to the personal data protection bill that is coming up? How does this work?
No, absolutely a good, fair question, I would say. But my legal expertise is limited, like I've highlighted in this.
No, I just want to understand your opinion, what you think about it.
Yes.
So, I mean, just your
No,
perspective
absolutely.
as a security compliance
Right.
professional. Yeah.
So, in regards to this, of course, for any of the audits that we do, or not talking for my organization, but as an audit as a profession, or risk assessment as a vertical we have to ensure that accountability of the actions have to be there, right? For let's say you take any case, via VPNs, how the Tor works, or how the onion routing works.
Yeah.
And with many new startups coming into the place where they are just telling that we provide a VPN service, and the business is then acquiring, like we talked about, the tier 2, tier 3 businesses acquiring, going in a lot of digitized way. PI getting collected, payment information getting collected, the addresses and all these things getting collected. How do we ensure that accountability is in place is number one. And when you talk about the accountability, there is also one thing that I'm sure is the regulators or risk professionals are aware of, is the anti-money laundering thing that is happening
Yeah.
across, right? That's a big concern, because if, let's say, tomorrow I take a VPN, or any layman takes a VPN, and the idea is to not traffic it out via the ISPs or the providers that we now have, and then route it to an unnoticed way. So probably it's a wrong use of funds, or how the tax evasions are happening, and there are certain more things. So really, from a financial angle, that becomes more of importance to understand if there are certain tax evasions, or AML, anti-money laundering things happening in place. Of course, that there are these apps which promote gambling, and all those things have come into the place right now. So from that angle, it's pretty much valid. But intrenching on the privacy, the right to privacy that we have, there has to be a common way, or a midway into this. That, of course, being a watchdogs, who will watch the watchdogs is a
Exactly.
very common phrase. Who will watch the watchdogs? So really, we'll have to come up with this. Like, we are evolving, India as a country is evolving in the digital space. There have to be right balances of checks, and the makes and checks around it, and things have to be ensured in place. And even if the information is shared with the government, or they're mandating that it has to be in place for 5 years, a clear direction stating that what is the risk. So, in a typical risk control matrix that we have, it highlights the risk. The risk has to be agreed by the stakeholders, and in this certain direction. If there is a push like we see in the market right now by not all but some of the players, there should be a forum which should address all these queries. That's what comes to my mind. And of course experts like your team or the different SMSCs SMSCs coming into the picture, small scale enterprises, helping to digitize more in this way can provide better inputs and better governance for the country like India, I'm sure.
Right, right. So I think, of course, that is what something the certain also talks about, right? The request for information part about it, that they can make requests for information that are related to cybersecurity incidents, and of course, we just have to make sure that the kind of data that is provided after a cybersecurity incident is also something that can fulfill the requirements that certain has also put up. Right. And I was also reading about the RBI's cybersecurity framework, right? It basically divides it into three annexures, one, two, three. And of course, it is something that has been, I think, roughly built using the ISO standard, the ISO 27001 standard. So it takes in a lot of controls or categories from there. But it also has a few additional measures such as anti-phishing, right? And as a security professional, I know that anti-phishing is not something that is very easy to achieve. You can use multiple different email security solutions, but even then, phishing emails are something that would still hit your inbox. I mean, it's the rules that you will have to configure takes a lot of maturity as an organization that you need to do, right? So that is something that is not very easy for banks or financial organizations or startups that are coming up to follow, right? And I think the 6 hour timeline that Certain has also mentioned is not very easy to achieve, right? So do you think, Aditya, it would be easy for an organization to at least assess and also share that information or report the incident to Certain within 6 hours?
So my thought in this, Krishna, like you were talking about, you mentioned about the technical expertise which is building for let's say, from top to bottom in a typical organization. So it's not a one team activity; it is a hand holding of multiple stakeholders. Again, depending on the scale or the organization size. For any bank, if certain things like this have to be reported, it is the hand holding for information security team, the information security, the IT teams, the incident for forensic team has to come into the place. They need to understand the logs. There are a lot of rigorous activities around it, right? So 6 hours complying to it, I think we have to be more equipped in the skills. And to comment whether it's right or not, uh, I think probably like there should be a forum given to the, like I was suggesting earlier as well, open forum should be given to the organizations, wherein of course teams are scaling up, the compliances are being scaling up for organizations, and to report it within 6 hours, it's definitely a challenge, but organizations are coming with it, and they are bringing in the technical experts who can help to do this, but it is definitely a challenge to comply within 6 hours.
Right, right. I think it is more something that a mature organization may actually achieve. But for an organization that is not actively mature, and I'm just quoting this recent report I read, I think it was from IBM or some organization, which talked about on how many average days does it take for an organization to actually detect a data breach. So that was around 287 days.
Yeah.
So it takes an organization around 287 days to actively detect a cybersecurity incident or a data breach incident. And to report it within 6 hours is something that could probably be a challenge to most organizations, especially given that for most non-tech organizations, they don't even have a dedicated IT team, let alone having a dedicated information security team. It is mostly the HR folks who would take care of giving accesses to people. And they somehow feel that having a Google workspace and giving accesses and sorting that access is enough for you to make sure that you're compliant to different data regulations. But that kind of awareness is something that I think we'll have to actively push, right? And since we are nearing towards the end of our webinar as well, we'll just go on to Menti again, right? I just want to understand if people here, people who are part of the attendees for this webinar, do they understand the RBI guidelines? And what are your views? Do you think the RBI guidelines propose infrastructure level changes, right? Because there's a cybersecurity framework that is being pushed. And if you are referring a cybersecurity framework, there are certain categories, controls, certain kind of gap assessments you would have to do to understand where you currently stand. So do you think the RBI guidelines are proposing infrastructure level changes is the question that I have for all the attendees. So just quickly go to menti.com, type in the code, put in your comments here. Yes, no, maybe. Maybe is, I think, the safest option, Aditya. I think people can.
Right.
Right. So I think we'll quickly move on to the next slide as well, Aditya, because I understand that the RBI definitely focuses more on having those security solutions or technological measures as well that you need to implement in your infrastructure, right? So what would be the impact of these RBI guidelines in your view?
Definitely a good question to bring up. With all these RBI guidelines, I think the deadline for tokenization is 30th June, or they are some date which is by July or June. I'm not sure
Yeah,
of
I
the.
think for the certain, it's 14 days from now
Mhm.
on making sure we can adhere to the circular that was dated, I think, 20th April. So yeah, I mean, the deadlines are coming close.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So it's more again to from any GDPR perspective or any bill that we've seen that is in place, which has got a lot of market attention. We are trying to limit the exposure of the data which is being collected or data which is being shared. So with tokenization, if we talk about, it's the payment card, it's in line to the PCI DSS. A lot of organizations, probably in the e-commerce world, or you talk about any other world wherein transactions are happening or transactions are being exchanged, right? So how do we ensure that the complete data set is not stored at an organization, or even in case where we are transferring the data for, let's say, capturing the payments or uh, ensuring the transactions happen properly? That's where that suggesting a tokenization approach. Storage of the data should be limited, the collection of the data should be limited. So it's again falling back to the CSUAD principle that we were discussing, Krishna. I
Yeah.
think, and specifying how should we or an organization collect the data, how should they store the data, what should the principles around the storage, and subsequently, it's I think always one should not have a anodizing way to approach this. It's always a silver lining in this, I feel, because storing the data is a cost to an organization, right? And all the compliances, accountability in place. Storing lots and lots of data is again a compliance cost, and which probably can be utilized if optimized in a proper way in growing the business. So one should think from that perspective as well. So all these compliances will definitely be scaled up. So tokenization is one, infrastructure you talked about in the last, and accession, as part of the redefining the transaction infrastructure. So a deregister token. So like, how do we deregister the tokens? We should not store it beyond a timeline. That's what I think comes a part of this. And the stake on startups, like the industry's unreadiness and the Shark Tank and all those things, promoting the startup culture more in India, and how we are equipped to handle the enormous amount of data. And the government is doing their part. It's our part that we have to understand and come to this at par. Everything may not be a perfect spot to be in. Of course, there are like, we are a democratic country. There are multiple views. We have to address the views and go around it. But things are in better way. And of course, if there are no guidelines, it's a famous today, something is better than nothing, right? So we have things in place, and I think the government is still open to have suggestions. There are pointers in time wherein the forums should be there, wherein experts like you should be called in, or industries like us, to have a round table or a table talk exercise to understand the current problems. That's where a correct implementation of these things can happen. But of course, these are in a good direction, I can say.
Definitely. I think there have been recent steps in at least making sure that we can push the digital India vision. And making everything digital also comes with a host of new challenges that have not been addressed as of now. So, data privacy laws, certain guidelines, RBI guidelines are something that are coming up to make sure that whoever or whatever organization that is trying to go digital, they also comply with the different regulations that the government has put up. Because, of course, having a lot of data is never helpful for everyone, right? Collecting data that you don't really need, even from an analytics purpose, it won't definitely help you. So I think that also brings us towards the end of this session, Aditya. We are right on time. That is great to know. And I just wanted to touch upon this last topic as well, on what startups can do and what key areas they can focus on to make sure that they can comply or at least have a start towards building a data protection infrastructure or an infrastructure that focuses on cybersecurity as well as data privacy, right? So having something as simple as a privacy or cookie policy on your website would definitely put you somewhere. Then having some kind of email security or making sure the configurations on the email provider that you're using is up to the standard as per industry best practices. Access management is something you should actively focus on. Implementing certain security solutions, something as simple as an endpoint security solution or an antivirus security solution, would definitely help your corporate systems to be protected by basic malwares or malwares that have been in the wild for a long time. It would not protect you against more advanced attacks, but at least, of course, the basic steps that you need to do is having an antivirus solution. The security and privacy awareness training, you need to push this across. You need to make sure that everyone has that kind of awareness around data security and data privacy. This needs to focus more on non-technical people because it would be harder for you to help them understand what kind of challenges there are in place for cybersecurity. And I think ISO 27001 is something that you can focus on because it, for startups, I think it's a very good way or a very good framework that you can refer to have an infrastructure that focuses on security and focuses on the data protection practices, right? And then later you can have the different standards that have demanded by the industry, such as ISO 27701 as well, which focuses on the privacy infrastructure, right? But ISO 27001 is a very good starting point for people who are unaware on what kind of framework they should refer to or how to strategize the active cybersecurity plan. So this would definitely help you, of course, come across as a startup or as an organization that focuses on cybersecurity, right? So I think this brings us to the end of the session as well, Aditya. And of course, if you have any questions, I think the attendees here were people who are very much aware about data privacy and cybersecurity. So we have also dropped in our LinkedIn's, Aditya and my LinkedIn, right? If you feel like connecting to us, just drop us a connection request and we are happy to have those conversations around data privacy and security. And if you have any follow-up questions after this webinar, feel free to reach out to us. I think we would be more than happy to, of course, address those issues and have a conversation around it. So I think, Aditya, thank you so much for giving your time here. I understand that it's a weekday and you have your office to look after or tend to as well. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your valuable inputs. And of course, thank you for all the attendees to making it here and making this a session which was informative for us as well.
Thanks, Krishna, for having me. Thanks all for hearing to us. Thank you.
Right. I think we'll close the session for now. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Bye-bye.